all. Thank you for joining me for our extended look at the last true GT car to win Le Mans outright, the fastest and most expensive production car in the world for what felt like decades, and the realization of the late Bruce McLaren's long-deferred dream of a road car bearing his name, the McLaren F1. In contrast to the stillborn M6 GT project, which started out as a redesigned Can-Am car for the road and the World Sports Car Championship, the F1 was never intended to take to the world's racetracks. Instead, as the name rather suggests, it came about as something of a celebration model following the McLaren Formula One's team very good year in 1988, which was subsequently followed by more years in the late 80s and early 90s, which saw cars designed by Gordon Murray and Steve Nichols. Quick point of clarification, it's been brought to my attention that, in correction of what I said in the original shorter video, Gordon Murray was technical director, not chief designer, for McLaren's Formula One cars, and thus served as more of a liaison between the drawing department and the production department. So, small correction, mea culpa. Moving on. Take 4 constructors and drivers championships between 88 and 91, with Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost building their legacies and their legends behind the wheel. Murray, whose previous experience also included 27 years of increasing responsibility and success at Brabham after he was unable to get a job at Lotus, was also named chief designer of the newly formed McLaren Cars division, established to leverage the company's racing expertise and high brand equity to boldly go where no McLaren had gone before: the public roads. Murray essentially had carte blanche for the new car, with his remit loosely phrased as build the ultimate road car. Price, no object. Murray wanted the car to reflect his design philosophy to a T, perfectly blending usability, safety, impeccable attention to detail, and drivability, while also embracing the F1 technologies that McLaren had pioneered or helped develop. Thus, the car was built around a carbon fiber monocoque, which McLaren had debuted in Formula One with the MP4/1, and put the driver in the middle, keeping some of the F1 inspiration, but also fulfilling what Murray had considered the perfect arrangement of seats since his youth, with a passenger seat flanking the drivers on each side. This did apparently require some traffic laws to be changed, but what are mere regulations against such singular vision and force of will? A visit to Honda's research facilities in Japan with Ayrton Senna led Murray to set the recently developed NSX as their benchmark for build quality and comfort, and as McLaren didn't build their own engines at the time, Murray also tried to convince Honda to build the Powerplant for his new car. He had a shopping list all ready, too, requesting a lightweight, F1-derived 10 or 12-cylinder engine in the 4.5-liter range with a weight of 250 kilos or 551 pounds, a block length of 23.6 inches or 600 millimeters, and an output of 550 horsepower. But the Japanese could not be convinced to undertake the project, and so a different zoom unit would have to be sought. Lightness was almost an obsession in the development of the car, which had led to the carbon fiber chassis, and would permeate the other design decisions as well. The bodywork was, of course, carbon fiber composite. The rack and pinion steering and brakes were both unassisted, although ABS was equipped, but the latter featured massive 13.1-inch front and 12-inch rear cross-drilled and ventilated Brembo platters with monoblock aluminum, I suppose that should be aluminium, 4-piston calipers. A standard handbrake was omitted. The wheels were custom designed and made from magnesium and wore equally custom Michelin rubber, and the as-yet-to-be-determined Powerplant would send its power through a 6-speed manual transaxle designed by Wiesmann in an aluminum housing. That one is more appropriately aluminum than aluminium because, of course, Wiesmann, despite being a German name, is based out of California. The obsession with weight savings meant that even the toolkit wrenches were made from titanium and then gold-plated, which is, well, maybe a bit extreme, but total weight was 2,513 pounds, or 1,140 kilos, for a car that still had 3 leather seats, butterfly doors, air conditioning, a 10 CD changer stereo, but no radio, as Murray didn't listen to it, electric windows, an electric defrosting windshield, and as much luggage space as a contemporaneous Ford Fiesta. Sort of. Compare that, for example, to the Jag XJ220, from which the F1 took the fastest production car crowned, It weighed 330 kilos more, made about 70 fewer horsepowers, had one fewer seat, and less luggage space. Even the Ferrari F40, generally held to be a paragon of supercar perfection and lightness, was 250 pounds heavier than the F1, less powerful to the tune of 150 horsepower, and it lacked a stereo, any real trim or interior appointments, and needed plastic instead of glass windows to make weight. Truly impressive stuff. So, Powerplant. Honda was out, but another Japanese manufacturer was interested in giving the project a go, Isuzu. Yes, perhaps better known for their large diesel engines, trucks, and buses, they had recently developed a 3.5-liter V12 for Lotus that was currently in testing, and from a technical standpoint, it would actually have fit the bill rather nicely. Though modifications for road-going applications would have changed these specs somewhat, in its final iteration it was reportedly capable of more than 750 horsepower, weighed only 158 kilos, or 348 pounds, and was only 90 millimeters longer in overall length than Murray's desired 600 millimeters for block length, so it may have actually fit that as well. But, as it had only done testing rather than actual racing miles, the team, like Lotus themselves as it turned out, opted to look for something with more experience backing it up. And of course, when it comes to motoring experience, one thinks of the Germans. Murray, whose ceiling needed painting after he managed to secure the U.S. distribution rights to Santa Claus vs. the Devil, despite being only 14 at the time.
Oh, Murray, the ceiling needs painting!
Very obscure reference there, had experience working with BMW during his time at Brabham, and so their M division, headed by Paul Roche, thoroughly reworked and redesigned their M70 V12, the first production 12-cylinder engine to come out of Germany since things were, well, a bit more swastika-y, but with a totally new aluminum head design, 4 valves per cylinder, 4 chain-driven overhead camshafts, variable valve timing, which was pretty experimental for the early 90s, and dry sump lubrication. Displacing just over 6 liters, it was about 6% heavier than the original design specs, but it produced between 618 and 627 horsepower, which worked out to about 16% more than requested. So the delta was actually in favor of the Powerplant overall. Oh, and quite famously, the engine bay was covered in gold foil to enhance heat management to prevent damage to the carbon chassis or bodywork. But wait, I hear you cry. Gold is one of the heaviest of the common elements, apart from lead, but lead's not very conductive. Which, yes, true, but its conductivity is such that only the thinnest coating for the bay was necessary, which ended up amounting to less than an ounce of actual gold being used in the construction of each car. I believe it was 16 grams? Doing that from memory, so don't fact check me on that. The suspension design, overseen by Steve Randall, was focused on a compromise of sportiness, drivability, practicality, and comfort rather than the more common focus on outright performance, and so used double wishbones, but of unequal length, to help improve road holding over more standard designs. A large rear wing was considered early on in the design, but was instead replaced with a small active rear spoiler that could deploy to dynamically balance the car at speed or under braking, and could direct air into ducts that helped cool the rear brakes. Downforce instead came from ground-effect Venturi tunnels integrated into the underbody design, and 2 electric fans mounted under the car, lending the vehicle its sleek and, in my opinion, rather timeless aesthetic. Pricing and performance were appropriately ludicrous to match the level of detail and engineering perfection that went into the car's design and construction, which reportedly took more than 6,000 man-hours per car, which, if you assume a 40-hour work week, 2,000 hours per year, is 3 years of equivalent man-hour work for each car. They completed about 3 a year on average, so that's, a team of 9 people working year-round? Am I doing that dimensional analysis right? Probably not, but who cares? The price was a princely sum of 640,000 British pounds, equal to about $800,000 in 1992, though, of course, that statistic's actually slightly irrelevant as it never made it to American shores. Performance for a stock version of the car was targeted at about 230 miles an hour, although in reality it achieved only 221 in independent tests, quite possibly limited by track length more than anything else, as I don't think anybody rented the shuttle landing facility down at NASA to do some top speed runs. That was still plenty to take the crown from the Jag XJ220. 0 to 60 was achieved in 3.2 seconds, 0 to 100 a bit longer than that at 6.2 seconds. Still quite respectable, but the number that everyone seems to remember, a top speed of 240, was not actually set until near the end of the car's production run, with a higher rev limit allowing the car to hit 8,300 RPM instead of the stock 7,500. There was also Andy Wallace behind the wheel, and the entirety of Volkswagen's Arlesian test track to max the car. Wallace would later go on to work as Bugatti's test driver, largely at the same venue, but that's a story for a different time. With all of this performance, it's, natural then that prospective customers would start clamoring for a racing version of the car as well. But Murray was adamant. His new machine was purely and simply a road car. The suspension was too soft, the doors were too large, active aero was disallowed in any major racing series, and even if it wasn't, there wasn't really a racing series for the car to compete in anyway. The last of these issues was solved without any input from McLaren with the establishment of the BPR Global GT Series, which featured new classes called GT1 through GT4. GT4s were the most production-related and budget-friendly machines, with complexity, speed, and expense increasing as the class numbers decreased, culminating in GT1. The regulations for GT1 were pretty loose, which would come into play later in the decade, but it meant that the F1 could be relatively easily converted to compete, had Murray been willing. But he wasn't. He stood as firm as Lady Thatcher, saying, well, the car's not for racing instead of this lady's not for turning. It took the continued entreaties of one Mr. Raymond Belm, which was probably a name that earned him some ribbing at school, as it's spelled Bel-M, and if you say it quickly, sounds like Bell End, whose experience included quite a bit of seat time in older chevrons before graduating up to modern machinery in the 1980s, when he co-founded Spice Engineering with Gordon Spice. He was part of the team that won the Group C2 Championship and Le Mans in class in 85, 86, and 88, so suffice it to say he knew his way around Circuit de la Sarthe. He had ordered a road-going F1 and was lobbying hard to get a racing version built to replace the Porsche he was racing at the time, but it took a lot of hinting to McLaren's CEO, Ron Dennis, that if they weren't willing to build him a race car, he'd just modify the road car that he'd ordered to finally soften the company's refusals. At that point, McLaren said they would be delighted to build him a car, for a nice round sum of £1 million. Which, of course, having already ordered one F1, he didn't exactly have to hand. But the seed of the idea had been planted, and eventually it sprouted and broke through the crust of Woking's refusals, with Dennis agreeing to drop the price if more prospective customers could be found. In what can only have otherwise been the start of a rather disappointing joke, a German banker and a transplanted Welsh CEO tossed their hats in the ring as well, and Gordon Murray was told to go turn his ultimate road car that shall never be raced into a proper GT1 racer, eligible for both the BPR Series and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. The ceiling was indeed never going to be painted, it seemed. So, the already featherweight F1 went on a further diet and fitness regimen. The passenger seats were tossed out, the suspension was firmed up. The catalytic converters were kindly donated to some local vagrants to save their hacksaw blades. 2 additional orders came in. Additional cooling ducts were cut into the appropriate locations, a roll cage was added, then another order came in. The active rear spoiler was replaced with a big fixed rear wing. Carbon brakes replaced the steel units. Actually, it's worth noting that Murray did consider carbon brakes for the road car as well, but as they would have too greatly diminished daily usability, they didn't make the cut. But most of the other fundamental elements actually went unchanged. The only modification to the Powerplant was a new engine management system and the series-mandated air restrictors. The gearbox remained the same, the driver's seat stayed front and center. They didn't even need to change the oversized doors for something more sensible, although admittedly that would have been a pretty big job. In all, the car lost 120 kilos, or 260-ish pounds? Math in my head again. And the V12 was capable of greater power with its new engine management system, but the air restrictors then pegged it back to only 592. The three initially ordered cars for Balme, the Welsh transplant, and the German banker were ready for the February 1995 BPR Global GT Series season opener at Jerez or Jerez, depending on whether you prefer Castilian or the rest of the world, which is in Spain, where it would be going up against the likes of the Porsche 911, the Venturi 600, the Jag XJ220, the Di Tommaso Pantera, which I'm amazed was still racing, and the Ferrari F40. No pressure, then. But despite it being the F1 GTR's debut outing, the car was ready to race and well on the pace. The three F1s present set the three fastest times in qualifying, but struggles with reliability during the race meant that only the man who started it all would actually see his car finish. But it was a finish on the top step of the podium. Balme and his co-driver Maurizio Sandro Sala won 5 of the 12 races that first season, with other F1s winning 5 more. Of the 2 that they didn't win, one round the teams all skipped because they were preparing for Le Mans, and the other round at Anderstorp, the Pilot Aldix Racing Ferrari of Michel Ferté and Olivier Devenin outpaced the McLarens to win the only competitive defeat for the cars that season. Back in France, the 63rd running of the great French endurance kerfuffle saw 7 F1 GTR entries, the 6 chassis that had been completed for the BPR series up to that point, and a 7th entry entered under the auspices of Lanzante Motorsport and Kokusha Kaihatsu Racing, but really representing the factory's interests, as it was the McLaren test chassis for developing the other cars, and McLaren personnel were providing the lion's share of the support, overseen by the firm's chief engineer, James Robinson. At least it wasn't Heath Robinson. Things didn't initially look quite so promising, however, despite the plurality of cars. Unlike in the BPR series, the F1 would be going up against purpose-built prototypes, not just other heavily modified versions of road cars, from the likes of Courage, Kremer, Welter Racing, and Ferrari, who had brought the 333 SP over from racing in IMSA to make their first attempt at an outright win at La Sarthe in 23 years. The previous year's victor, however, the Dower 962, which was a Group C car, slightly reworked to fit the GT1 rules, had been banned for not keeping in the spirit of those rules, the application of which would not be remembered in subsequent years. Again, story for another time and already covered. The GT1 field was a bit more fleshed out as well. In addition to many of the more competitive BPR series machinery, there were entries from Toyota and Nissan with their Supra GT LM and Skyline GTR LM respectively. Honda was running an NSX in class, and Lister had even managed to get enough cash together to enter a racing version of their Storm, which borrowed some of its powertrain components from the old Jag XJR9. So more Group C legacy machinery showing up well after it was supposed to have gone away. But it was the prototypes that would be the biggest challenge for the McLarens, as they were purpose-built to take on Le Mans and, consequently, noticeably faster on per-lap pace. The 2 Welter racing cars closed out the front row of the grid, with William David the first man ever to take pole on his Le Mans debut, with the exception of whoever, took pole the first year, but they didn't do it by pole times back then. It was done by displacement, so... Anyway, he was followed by the Courages, the best of the Kremers, and then, somewhat unexpectedly, the 3 F40s, ahead of the factory-supported McLaren, which was the fastest of the Magnificent Seven. To be fair, the F40s had actually, on pure single-lap pace, been equal or slightly faster than the McLarens in some of the BPR races, but they just didn't have the reliability to keep up with the F1s. Also, one of the other McLarens was apparently running on a fuel made from beets, so perhaps it's really the Magnificent Six and the Vegetarian. There was also a Callaway Corvette that took pole for GT2, but that's not relevant for the purposes of this story. The race itself would prove to be a sodden one. The start was in clear weather, however, and the fastest of the prototypes quickly pulled away from the rest of the field for, the first hour or so, until the rains came, causing issue after issue for the prototypes. The safety car had to be deployed around hour 5 when Patrick Gonin, from France, could be Patrick Gonin, when Patrick Conin, in one of the welter racing prototypes, lost control going over some standing water headed into the Lausanne kink, somersaulting the car, breaking 4 ribs and a shoulder blade. He was hospitalized and would go on to recover. The restart saw Bob Wallach in the leading Courage now under attack by no less than 4 of the McLarens, which had worked their way up the order by a combination of the rainy conditions, their better range than the prototypes owing to their larger fuel tanks, and the other quick GT1s suffering reliability issues for Ferrari. But then Bob handed over to Mario Andretti, who had a meeting of minds and fenders with a Kremer and lost the lead 30 minutes and 6 laps in repairs. The Kremers were apparently particularly tricky in the wet, and the Porsches were just managing to keep on pace with the McLarens as the rain continued to fall, as so too did the night. Nighttime saw both of the Belm-entered F1s struggling, with Philippe Alliot retiring the first of the McLarens from the lead after a scrap with a GT2 Porsche that he had just passed. David Price's cars then inherited and alternated the lead until hour 9, when the second F1 fell, victim of a slipping clutch. Gearbox issues would then start to plague many of the other remaining McLarens, but the factory-supported entry of Yannick Dalmas, J.J. Leto, and Masanori Sekiya slowly worked its way up the order to see sunrise from second place, 4 laps ahead of the best-placed prototypes, the aforementioned Wallach, Andretti, Elari, Courage in third. The rain slackened with the rising sun, allowing the Courage to make the best of its speed in the dry, but the duel between the 2 leading McLarens tightened after the other David Price entry, the surviving one, driven by Andy Wallace alongside Derek and Justin Bell, pitted for new brakes and rejoined less than a minute ahead of the Kokusai car being driven by J.J. Leto. Bell the Elder and Leto went at it hammer and tongs and stayed out of the reach of the prototypes until the end was in sight. But with 22 hours elapsed and 2 to go, the Wallace and Bell squared car started to develop more serious gear selector issues, ceding the lead to Yannick Dalmas. Andretti sailed by in the final hour, regained the lead lap from J.J. Leto, and handed over to Wallach in hopes of a final charge for the win. He attempted to close the gap and battle for the lead, but time's march did not favor the courageous, or courageous, if you will, that day, and though they finished behind the factory-supported car on the lead lap, it was most of a lap in arrears to the black and gray number 59 machine, which had run an essentially faultless, consistent race to grant McLaren their first Le Mans victory after their much-delayed Le Mans debut. They matched Ferrari's 1949 victory against a much more competitive field, that being the first victory on a Mark's debut. But, of course, the 1949 race was the first race back after everyone took a decade-long break to argue over Poland, so arguably more of an achievement. It was the first victory for a Japanese driver, a Finnish driver, and F1s took 3rd, 4th, and 5th in the overall standings. I think that we can classify that as pretty nearly a walkover, certainly for a car on its first outing at Les Arts. It's also worth noting that the factory car had avoided the gear selection issues of several other F1s because the team's race engineer, Graham Humphreys, had realized that the wet conditions were causing the accumulation of dirt, mud, and all sorts of other nasties in the exposed gear linkage, which mixed with water and the silicone lubricating grease for the gear linkage and ground away at the mechanism until it failed. Obviously, a proper engineering solution was out of the question due to time constraints, so it was time for the
handyman's secret weapon, duct tape.
No, not that one, the other one, WD-40. They flooded the area where the grit was collecting at each pit stop with the stuff, and this made all the difference. And they, of course, sailed home to victory. The 1999 24 Hours of Le Mans would prove the high point of the car's racing career. And as such, we'll just touch on some of the overarching elements of the rest of it, but it was by no means the end. Heading into 1996 season, additional production saw cars entered not just in the BPR series, but in the All Japan GT Championship by Team Go, GOH, with what would become the British GT Championship by Lansante Motorsports, and also in Brazil after the regular competition season ended that year. But the design was not just left idle in the off-season. The resounding successes of 1995 had brought a flood of additional orders, and with the extra money, McLaren decided to develop the car more mindfully than they had done with their late 1994 crash program. The success of the 95 season belied the fact that the car was not without its weaknesses, and with the prospect of new competition, mostly in BPR and at Le Mans, that was coming in the form of an updated F40 GTE that aimed to match the car's seriously quick per-lap pace with better reliability, the new F50 GT1 that used the Powerplant from the 333 SP, Porsche yet again playing fast and loose with the rulebook and developing the upcoming 911 GT1, well, updates were needed to keep the F1 GTR at the top of the podium for a second season. For that second season in the BPR, the car would be swimming against the tide as well. Victim of its own success, the series-mandated air restrictors were increased in size by more than 4 times that of the F40's increase, sending it down on power compared to its rivals. So, they needed to make it even more nimble and improve its endurance, and that meant, well, more weight savings. The ride height was lowered, brake sizes increased, the engine and transmission was lowered within the body to improve the center of gravity, and the engine map was changed to keep horsepower as close to 600 as possible, while displacement, compression, and so on remained unchanged. The transmission, on the other hand, had its aluminum housing replaced with magnesium, while the internals were reinforced to improve durability. Subtle bodywork changes improved downforce and workability in the pits with quick-release clips, in all saving 38 kilos over last year's model. 5 road cars were produced to the new spec for homologation purposes, with 8 new racers ordered and another prototype built, again for development purposes. An upgrade package was available for 95 spec cars as well, I think at £138,000, but I could be wrong because, again, going off of memory. 1996's competition outings for the car were still successful, but not quite as dominant as the year prior. The BPR series saw the most participation yet again, with Ray Belm and James Weaver, the most successful of the entrants, with 4 wins out of McLaren's total 7, with the later season races showing that Porsche's new GT1 was indeed in a class of its own, despite being ineligible for points that year. Maybe because it was still effectively a 962 in a slightly more subtle repackaging than they tried at Le Mans 2 years prior. I wonder. BMW Motorsport had purchased 3 of the new cars in preparation for their upcoming return to Le Mans, running 1 race in the BPR series in preparation for Le Mans, but it was Belm and Weaver that won the Drivers' Championship and GTC competition that thus won the Teams' Championship. Again, because the 911 GT1s were ineligible for points. In the British Championship that year, the 1995 spec Lansante car was strong on pace in qualifying, but only managed to win a single race, taking the GT1 class championship pretty easily, but not against much competition, but losing the overall competition to a variety of the more numerous and more reliable GT2s and 3s. Lansante gave up after that season. But while McLaren struggled at home, it did extremely well over in the land of the rising sun, where Team Goa enjoyed some tacit support from the factory and took victories in 4 of the 6 rounds of the season, beating the factory-supported Toyota and Nissan squads as only the second non-Japanese-built car to win the All-Japan Grand Touring Championship in the GT500 class. More on subsequent seasons here in a moment. Now over to the weather. Not really. Le Mans 1996 did again seem to favor the odds of a prototype victory, with the qualifying lead taken by the new Yost-run TWR Porsche WSC 95 that was also actually a largely rebuilt Group C Franken car, but as it was running as a prototype, that was fine. It led the fastest of the Courages and a Ferrari 333 SP, then came the Porsche GT1s. The fastest of the McLarens was down in 8th, which was the BMW Motorsports entered Team Begazzi car, driven by Steve Soper. The race, however, provided no real opportunities for the F1s to use their greater endurance, wet weather performance, or reliability to work their way into the lead because it stayed pretty darn dry, and Porsches carried the day. The TWR prototype, despite some hard charging by Bob Wallach in the best of the Porsche GT1s, never faltered and carried Alexander Wurz, Davy Jones, and Manuel Reuter to victory ahead of the 2 GT1s. McLaren's did fill the next 3 slots, but the best was 16 laps behind the winning car and only third in class, rather disappointing after the prior year's success. And, heading into 1997, our intrepid Tommies were again threatened by more Jerry chicanery. Porsche was updating the GT1 further, and Mercedes was coming with the new CLK GTR, neither of which kept even remotely within the spirit of the GT1 rule set. McLaren decided to up the ante as well, making the 97 version of the F1, called the GT, the most aggressive ever. The bodywork and aero were totally changed, far more dramatically than ever before, with the new car sporting extra long overhangs, louvered side panels, much wider front and rear wheels, and, as mentioned in the overhang, that massive Longtail and wing. The engine was reduced very slightly in capacity in attempts to improve reliability, while the 6-speed manual was replaced with an X-Track sequential unit. These revisions did improve the car's pace relative to the prior year, but the competition had improved too. The BPR Championship became the FIA GT Championship, and McLaren was working more closely with BMW than ever before in pursuit of victory against Merc and Porsche. The new car was able to keep up with the Porsches and even outpace them from time to time, but the new CLKs were faster yet, suffering only on reliability early in the season. But as the season progressed, Mercedes improved, proving indomitable in the later races, with McLaren only taking 1 late-season victory at Mugello to finish the season championship in second. BMW then ended the partnership at the end of the season, and McLaren declined to continue directly supporting teams in 1998 after the CLK LM debuted, and they saw the writing on the wall. And seeing as the CLK LM was the car that killed the GT1 class at the GT Championship due to its dominance in '98, that was probably a wise financial decision. Le Mans in '97 went a bit better for McLaren, with 6 entries holding up the marque's honor, and despite a remarkable number of fires amongst the participants, both from McLaren and otherwise, and a field of GT1 competitors that included factory entries from Nissan, Porsche, Panoz, and Lister, the 2 cars that did finish took first and second in class, second and third overall, behind the same car, indeed the same chassis, that had won the previous year. They had actually arguably better chances that year after only 1 prototype, the winning Yost TWR Porsche WSC 95, which is an incredibly cumbersome name. Admittedly, Yost is just the team that's running it, qualified ahead of the best of the GT1s, and didn't seem to be quite as pacey as last year. By the final hours of the race, this almost seemed to be bearing out, with the number 26 Porsche GT1 setting the race's fastest lap and hunting down the TWR Porsche, except for the fact that it too then went up in flames, leaving only 1 Gulf McLaren to challenge Yost for a repeat victory. They didn't manage it, and came home second, still 1 lap adrift, while the McLaren that would likely have taken 5th became the final sacrifice to the gods of fire and oil to close out one of the highest attrition races in recent memory. By 1998, the car was approaching superannuation and made far fewer competition appearances. 2 privateers entered Le Mans that year, of which 1 finished in 4th overall, behind 2 of the newest Porsche GT1s and a Nissan GT1, so 4th in class as well, but of course none of those were proper GT cars. But it was in Japan where the cars enjoyed an active retirement. At least 1 97 spec car would see entries through 2003, with 2 cars running intermittently in the series, taking 1 final, somewhat unexpected victory at Mine Circuit, that might be pronounced Mine, circuit with Team Take 1 in 2001, before finally retiring with, Hitotsuya Racing 2 years later. At the time, it was the last F1 racing anywhere in the world, which in this instance could mean F1 could also stand for Final One. In total, 106 F1s were manufactured, including 64 road cars, 5 LM versions, 3 GT Longtails, 5 prototypes, 28 race cars of varying bodyworks, and a single LM prototype. It's worth noting that the 5 LMs and the 3 GTs were homologation specials. Following the primary superannuation of the racing models in 1998, McLaren did convert several of them to road-going spec, arguably creating, somewhat ironically, the ultimate race car for the road version of the ultimate road car never intended for the racetrack. McLaren still offers extensive service and support for F1 owners, up to and including major reconstruction in the event of a structurally significant crash, which has happened on several occasions owing to the car's uncompromising driving dynamics, shall we say. Ron Atkinson has reportedly been caught out at least twice driving his, so it's fortunate that he doesn't live too terribly far from McLaren's headquarters in Woking. On the rare occasion one does come up for sale, values have recently surpassed $20 million at auction, rarefied but completely understandable values for a car that, perhaps more than any other, defined the attitude and excesses of the 1990s. Interestingly, the F1's Powerplant did see service with its actual manufacturer, as a version was further developed for BMW's late 90s Le Mans prototype efforts that peaked with their 1999 win in the V12 LMR, although this version did not use some of the more exotic materials like titanium valves and conrods, nor did it feature variable intake geometry. Well, it's happened again. I've written a much longer video than intended, and you've wasted another perfectly good 40 minutes listening to some car talk. Going forward, I think we're going to do short and long versions of each single car-focused video, both to pad out the posting frequency because life continues to get crazier and crazier, and because they, generally speaking, appeal to different viewer sets, but be that as it may. For this week's shameless plugs for other videos on the channel. 1997 Le Mans already has a full video covering its events, although it's been copyright stricken because of the bastards at Duke Video and some band that claims they own the rights to the McLaren catching fire going down the Mulsanne, which is weird, but YouTube's a mess. We've already covered all the GT1 rules, chicanery, and DEFCON GT. GT classes explained with nuclear war. We talked about the McLaren M6 GT a couple of weeks ago in a 5 Cars That video. We mentioned Ferrari's 1949 Le Mans win during the first part of a short history of sports car racing part 1. Yes, part 2 is still in the works, although I've pressed pause for a short while to work on a strictly Carrera Panamericana-focused series and put away some money to buy a copy of Time in Two Seats. If there's anyone that wants to contribute to the book fund, there's a link to buy me a coffee in the description, and if you'd like, I'll even send you a printed photo of your choice. What else? I've covered the Ferrari 333 SP and Panos GTR one in their own videos. The Ferrari 333 SP video does feature one of my favorite shots from the first Daytona Historics I attended, and I think that's it. I think you can see the TWR WSC 95 car and the race-winning McLaren F1 GTR in the Le Mans Museum video, if that piques your interest. And that probably about covers it. Now for this week's call to action, not featuring the 3 sacred words of YouTube. Good lord, there are a lot of typos in this script. I was very tired. I'll use the old... Those aren't the 3 sacred words of YouTube, by the way. James, play it.
Like, comment, subscribe.
I'll just remind you that as we're moving into spring, it's about time to change your air filters once again. And if you're feeling bold this weekend, go ahead and delve deep into your random junk drawer. You know the one. Viewers of Ashens will also know it as the Drawer of Purgatory, where all the odds and ends accumulate over the years. And let us know the strangest or most nostalgic thing you find there. That most interesting response gets a heck of a shout out in next week's video if I remember. Or, I don't know, go hug a relative. There, that's 3 random calls to action for the price of 1. And with that, I have but to say, of course, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.